We do Ellen White a great injustice when we don't tell her story. Historically, the personal side of Ellen White has been something Adventists have not really emphasized or really understood. You go to the mid-20th century, the 1950s, 1960s. Ellen White was presented as someone who literally floated 3 feet off the ground, was a perfect saint, and everything she spoke, every word was ex cathedra, as if God was speaking directly. And that is a gross misunderstanding of Ellen White. That idea continued throughout the 20th century. I was a convert to Adventism in the late 1970s as a young man, and I remember hearing some of those ideas in my early years as an Adventist. And some of those ideas still are around today. But what we want to do is understand Ellen White as a person, the personal life story of Ellen White. So my subject this morning, Ellen White, her legacy as a person. So I asked the question, will the real Ellen White please stand? There's so many different views of Ellen White. But what we want to do is get the real historical Ellen White. And she was a regular human being like the rest of us, a faulty human being. In fact, if you read the Bible carefully, the prophets were also regular human beings. They had an extraordinary gift, but they made mistakes in their lifestyle. Think of David, who was so blessed by God, the king, and had the gift of inspiration, and yet made some profound, immoral mistakes. He was human. He was human. So prophets are human, and we do them a great injustice when we don't look at the human side and compare and contrast that with the divine side, the work of God in and upon their lives. So will the real Ellen White please stand? She's actually a forgotten figure in history. Historians of American religious history outside of the Adventist community have in recent years developed an interest in Ellen White. Some years ago I was at a meeting with Adventist historians and former Adventist historians and historians outside of the Adventist community, and the subject was Ellen White. And it was so interesting to hear all the different views of Ellen White, but those outside of the Adventist circle were very interested, keenly interested in Ellen White and what she was like. So in a sense, she's been a forgotten figure of 19th century American religious history, but she's coming back, and people are beginning to focus on Ellen White, historians outside of the Adventist circle. So it's important that we as a people understand her historically and personally. So again, will the real Ellen White please stand? She was a visionary, a church leader, a public speaker, a prolific author. These are the ways we know her, but we tend to forget that she was also a daughter, a sister, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a friend to many. So will the true Ellen White, the real Ellen White, please stand? She had indeed extraordinary experiences. She was brought in the presence of God. She saw angels. Here she wrote, I am taken into the presence of Jesus and angels, and I'm entirely lost to earthly things. Her inaugural vision took place in December of 1844, just a couple of months after the disappointment. She was 16 years old during the great disappointment of October 22, 1844. In November, she turned 17, so when she had her first inaugural vision, visualized here on the screen, she was 17 years old. It's where she saw the people of God walking on the narrow path, and that vision was a great help to the Adventists as they were trying to find their way after the great disappointment. And it pulled them together where they eventually met in the historic Sabbath conferences that I mentioned last night. But what we want to do is understand the person of Ellen White, the personal side. So let's start with her family. Her parents were of British ancestry, sturdy New England stock. There's been some thought that she may have some African American blood in her. The White estate has hired 2 genealogists over the years to study this, genealogist scholars, and they concluded that she's of sturdy New England stock, and if in the future it were found that she did have African American blood in her veins, in her history, that would be great. No problem with that at all. They just wanted to get the facts right, and so far the conclusion is of New England stock. Her father, Robert F. Harmon, he was a farmer when Ellen was born in Gorham, Maine. He was a farmer. But then after Ellen was born, he brought the family to Portland, Maine, and got into the hat business and did pretty good making hats. Her mother was Eunice Gould Harmon. Gould, of course, is where we get the Ellen G. in Ellen G. White, later White when she married James White. But her mother was a housewife, homemaker. Ellen's mother had a profound impact on young Ellen spiritually. She was always watching for her children to make sure that they loved God and loved Jesus. And so Ellen's mother was a very strong spiritual influence upon her. They were members of the Portland, Maine Chestnut St. Methodist Church. That church still stands today in Portland, Maine. And they were disfellowshipped because of the Millerite views. If you study the Millerite movement in the early years that William Miller began to preach throughout the 1830s, the early 1840s, he was welcomed. He was actually a church growth agent. Preachers loved to have William Miller come to the church and speak because the church would always grow. But as they got down to the hour, got down to the period when he said Jesus was going to come, well, all the preachers of that day were post-millennialists, which means they believed that Christ was coming after the millennium, not before the millennium. Miller said Jesus is coming before the millennium. He was a premillennialist like we are today. Christ comes before the millennium. But most of the 19th century or early 19th century thought in America was that Christ would come after the millennium. So when Miller began to focus on a period of time, he said around 1843 originally, then it would change to 1844, that Christ was coming, the pastors began to withdraw from the Millerites, and it went against their doctrine of Christ coming at the end of the millennium and America getting better and better, and so they began to discipline the Millerites. And many of them were disfellowshipped from their churches, including the Harmon family. And Adventist scholars, one in particular, went to the basement of this church and found some of the old papers, historic papers. And he actually was able to trace all of the Millerite families that were disfellowshipped from that church, and found that the very first family to be disfellowshipped because of the Millerite views was the Harmon family. So it was very humiliating for them. The children, it was embarrassing. They lost all of their friends. That building on the Adventist Heritage Tours that we do up in that area, there's one taking place this fall. That building still stands. It's no longer a church. It's a restaurant now, at least the last time that I was there. But in the early years when I was doing Adventist Heritage Tours, it was still a church. So the Harmon family, Ellen White's family, they were the first Millerites to be disfellowshipped from this church. Ellen had a large family, a number of siblings, 5 sisters, including a twin, and 2 brothers. Let me just walk through very briefly her siblings. Caroline Harmon, later married into the Clough family. She was the wife of a Methodist clergyman. Most of the ministers that joined the Millerite movement, they were Methodist. You had many different denominations represented, but Methodists were very prominent. And so it was natural for the girls to enter into relationships with men who were Methodist and would become Methodist pastors. So she married a Methodist clergyman, and Caroline was Ellen's oldest sister. Here's a picture of Ellen on the screen left and Caroline on the screen right that you can see there. Ellen was 44 years old at the time. Her older sister Caroline was 60. Ellen had a good relationship with her sisters. When she was experiencing her early visions and she would travel to share those visions, her sisters went with her and supported her in that. But as things developed and this group of Adventists eventually became Seventh-day Adventist, not all of Ellen's family followed her in that. And then years later, when the church was established officially in 1863 as the Seventh-day Adventist denomination, or movement, and that is an organized church. A number of her sisters didn't follow her in that. But what is interesting is the letters between the siblings. And in writing to Caroline, Ellen one time said, "Caroline, you know, your gift is singing, but my gift is speaking." Ellen herself was like me. She could not sing. That's why whenever the song service is going on and I'm singing, I make sure the mic is off. You don't want to hear me, and I don't want to hear me. I want my voice to be lost with all the other voices in singing. Ellen was like that. She didn't sing. She said, "Caroline," because her sister could sing beautifully, "your gift is singing, but my gift is speaking." Ellen White understood that her unique gift was public speaking, and she did quite well at that. She could hold crowds of 20,000 on the edge of their seats when she preached. I'll share a little bit more of that in a little bit when I have a picture of her speaking, a rare picture of Ellen White speaking to a group. She also shared with her sisters about her faith, and one thing you notice in the letters is that while her sisters, at least Caroline, for example, never kept the Sabbath, never became a Seventh-day Adventist, rejected the three angels' messages, Ellen White wrote that while we have differences, our hearts are one. And you see, time and time again, she affirmed the faith of her sisters. Even though they were not in the Adventist faith, she affirmed the faith of her sisters. Ellen White understood that people will be going to heaven outside of the Adventist church. And I think we get a good example from Ellen White how to relate to people of other churches. God is working with, we're not the only one he's working with. God is working out there with other people in other churches. And I tell my students in my Adventist Heritage class, the best way to witness is to become friends with other people, with other Christians. And Ellen White said repeatedly, connect on the areas that you agree with, the inspiration of the Bible, the second coming of Jesus, the salvation by faith alone in Christ. Connect on these areas, and out of the context of friendship, you can be a witness, because God is at work among these people. And it may surprise us that there's going to be a lot more Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians and Catholics in heaven than there are Adventists. Do you think that's possible? God is at work out there. Yes, of course we realize there is deception, not diminishing that at all, and we want to stick with Bible truth, but we also need to recognize that God is working among all Christians today. And Ellen White understood that. And she affirmed the Christianity of her sisters outside of her Adventist faith. And that's a great lesson for us, I believe. I was sharing this at a camp meeting some years ago, and a lady came up and said, "Well, Ellen White must have not fully understood the three angels' messages." I just nodded. What can you say? There's this idea that in some places, it's becoming more rare in Adventism that Adventists are the only ones that are, have the inside with God and going to be in heaven. And you don't find that attitude with Ellen White at all. She definitely believed God raised this church up, and God was working in this church, and his people are special in God's eyes. But she also recognized that God is working with the larger body of Christians as well, and loves them just as much. So we learn that from a relationship with her sisters. And another sister, Harriet, also married a Methodist clergyman. And then a brother, John B. Harmon. He was a businessman. Eventually ended up being a businessman in Illinois. These did not become Adventists. But Mary Plummer Harmon Foss, she accepted the Seventh-day Adventist beliefs but never became a baptized member. And Sarah Harmon Belden did become a Seventh-day Adventist once the church was a actual body, church denomination. And then Robert F. Harmon was the only brother of Ellen to become a Seventh-day Adventist. He died of consumption at age 27. Consumption is a term that they use to describe what we know today as tuberculosis. It literally consumed you, so they called it consumption. Another 19th century euphemism that they used, if you were dying on your deathbed, they said you're marked for the grave. you're marked for the grave. If you were coughing, you were being consumed by this disease that we now call tuberculosis, consumption. And so her brother died of consumption. And that was very difficult for Ellen because she and her brother were very close. They had a great relationship, and she grieved greatly when her brother, Robert, died. Elizabeth was her fraternal twin sister. She married a Quaker whose business was in managing a grocery store. His name, of course, was Bangs. This was Ellen's fraternal twin, and so she married Reuben Bangs. The interesting feature of Lizzie, as Ellen White called her twin sister, was that Lizzie rejected the Christian faith. In being disfellowshipped from their church, that was very hard on the girls. They lost their friends, and of all the sisters, Lizzie took it the hardest. And Lizzie not only left the Adventist faith, she left Christianity altogether and had nothing to do with it. Her husband, Reuben, he was an inactive Quaker. They had one child, and Ellen was burdened for Lizzie. And throughout her lifetime, she endeavored to lead Lizzie to Jesus. I'm going to share with you a letter that Ellen White wrote to Lizzie a little later on in my presentation. It'll fit better later on. But here's a picture of Ellen and Lizzie. Ellen is in the standing position. Lizzie is sitting. You'll notice while they're fraternal twins, the noses are different because Ellen had an accident, which we'll talk about here in a moment. This picture was taken in 1878. And the accident happened when Ellen White was age 9. Ellen suffered a tragic accident that she later wrote was to affect my whole life. If you've ever read the stories, heard the stories about Ellen White, this accident was significant. The background is they were in Portland at the time. She had a childhood argument with a girl, and she and her sister it evidently got bad enough that Ellen was left, and they were trying to get away from the girl. They were walking in the back streets and took a shortcut through what was called a commons, or a little park. Today there's a parking garage there with a parking lot, but it was a little park. And they were cutting through that park to get home as fast as they could. The girl that Ellen had been arguing with in the childish trifle was following them, probably throwing rocks just to scare them. And one of the rocks that she threw, evidently, as Ellen turned to see where the girl was at, it hit her in the face. Evidently was thrown hard and I mean knocked her out, and it drew a lot of blood. And Ellen remembered just very vaguely waking up in a grocery store. Evidently the girl that hit her felt bad, and one of her sisters was with her, and they took her to a store, and she woke up and there was blood on her dress. Then she lost consciousness, and they picked her up and helped her in a delirious way walk back home. Nowadays, because of Ellen's small size, that rock did significant damage, and she probably today would have been taken to a hospital on a stretcher with a neck brace to make sure that she was stabilized, but they picked her up and carried her, and that just intensified the trauma, and so she was basically in a coma for 3 weeks after that. So things that she learned about that experience are what she was told. She was put in a great cradle. She describes it here. She was in a coma 3 weeks. She laid in what she was told was a great cradle. It was constructed for her, and she stayed in that cradle for many additional weeks. And when friends would come in to see her, they would shake their heads. They were sad. Her little distorted face was just looked so sad. And they said, she's marked for the grave, marked for the grave. As far as they could tell, she was on her way to death. She wrote about what she was told of that experience. I was reduced almost to a skeleton. And her personal physician and family, because of her face was so swollen and distorted, they didn't even recognize her. Her father had been away during the accident on business. When he came back, he walked in and she had consciousness now, and she recalls that her own father didn't recognize her. Where's my Ellen? That's not my Ellen. Her face was so disfigured. Of course, she had all the swelling, and so forth. Convinced that she was dying, the young 9-year-old Ellen gave her heart to Jesus in simple faith. Ellen White's conversion took place in 3 phases. This was the first phase. She accepted Jesus in a simple way, believing that she was going to die and she wanted to go to heaven. Several months later, on January 25, 1837, a dramatic aurora borealis lit up the New England sky, the Northern Lights. You know about that. I understand they're in this area as well. But this particular one was bright. I read a number of newspaper articles about this, and it was so vivid that people thought it was the end of the world. They thought it was the second coming of Jesus. Young Ellen was awakened in the night, hearing the screaming and loud talking of the neighbors. And she saw the glow outside and asked her mother to take her to the window, and her mother showed her the beauty, and Ellen thought, with all the noise from the neighbors, this is the second coming. Jesus is coming. She clapped her hands. She was so thrilled because all this pain and misery would go away and Jesus would take her. And so she waited, and eventually those lights faded away. She wrote about that experience afterward, but I was disappointed. The singular appearance faded away from the heavens, and the next morning the sun arose the same as usual. Jesus was not coming. The prospect that she must continue living in the midst of her suffering extinguished Ellen's short-lived childlike joy, and it plunged her into deep depression. Over the next 4 years, she struggled with discouragement and chronic depression. If she would have been examined by a therapist today, she would have been diagnosed with chronic depression. As a tween, that's what she experienced. Because of her poor health, she could not return to school and gave up her hope of an education, something she desired very much. That was hard for Ellen. She was very good in school. In fact, years later, when she was traveling on a train as an adult, a lady tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Is your name Ellen? Ellen Harmon?" Of course, Ellen said, "Yes, Ellen Harmon White." And the girls recognized each other. This was a classmate when she was in the little school in Portland. And that classmate, now an adult, said to her, because Ellen would write about this experience later, that I remember so well that when we were in class, the teacher always called on you to read. Nobody else. You were the one who could read better than all of us. So that gives us a glimpse into Ellen White's very young academic experience. She was a very good student, evidently one of the teacher's favorites. And so not being able to go back to school was very depressing for her. That's why in later life, Ellen White would become self-educated. Often we say, oh, she had no education and look what she did, but we need to realize she did a lot of work herself. She read a lot. She had a huge library in her adult years that she used and read a lot. And that's important when you come to the issues of the plagiarism charge against Ellen White, and recognizing that she engaged in legitimate literary borrowing. She read lots of things, and it stimulated things that she saw in vision, and she drew from certain phrases from other authors, but her own writings, her final product, were her distinct signature. And so it was different from the sources that she borrowed from. But like many religious writers of the day, and this has been documented with Adventist scholarship and studying the books that Ellen White used and how she used them, she clearly engaged in legitimate literary borrowing. But the point in this setting is that she was a really good student. She had a bright mind, and in these early days, not being able to go back to school plunged her into deep depression. I was unreconciled to my lot, she wrote, and at times murmured against the providence of God in thus afflicting me. She had a very sensitive conscience. And so the fact that she was murmuring against God, she felt guilt because of that, and that made her feel separate from God, or separated from God. Her conscience was unusually sensitive, and she experienced strong feelings of guilt over her resentment. Her simple faith in Jesus disappeared, and she was left in darkness. So that was the end of her first phase of her conversion experience. This feeling was compounded by her belief in an eternally burning hell, which exacerbated her fear and agony of soul. I alluded to this last night, of course, in growing up as a Methodist. following the teachings of John Wesley. John Wesley was a theological mentor to Ellen White, and she followed in that tradition, that theological tradition of Methodism the rest of her life, but of course there were aspects of it that she didn't agree with. But at this point, she did espouse the Methodist understanding, which is the wider Christian understanding that there is hell lasts forever and ever and ever. And that was terrifying to young Ellen. It intensified her fear and agony of soul. Reflecting back on that experience, she wrote about the impact of the doctrine of eternal burning hell on her emotional experience. She wrote, "In my mind," she's reflecting back on that area in her childhood, "in my mind, the justice of God eclipsed his mercy and love. The mental anguish I passed through at this time was very great. I had been taught to believe in an eternally burning hell, and as I thought of the wicked state of the sinner without God, without hope, I was in deep despair. I feared that I should be lost and that I should live throughout eternity a living death. The horrifying thought was ever before me that my sins were too great to be forgiven and that I should be forever lost. When the thought took possession of my mind that God delighted in the torture of his creatures who were formed in his image, a wall of darkness seemed to separate me from him. When I reflected that the creator of the universe would plunge the wicked into hell, there to burn through the ceaseless rounds of eternity, my heart sank with fear, and I despaired that so cruel and tyrannical a being would ever condescend to save me from the doom of sin. I thought that the fate of the condemned sinner would be mine, to endure the flames of hell forever, even as long as God himself existed. Almost total darkness settled upon me, and there seemed no way out of the shadows." And see, that's a side of Ellen White that many Adventists don't know. That is her experience as a young person. It's quite remarkable that she would come out of this. She was clinically depressed, and that really is what I meant before, that she would be diagnosed clinically depressed. And some of these doctrinal understandings exacerbated that. She also read devotional books from the church library that described little girls as living saintly lives free from doubt, sins, and weaknesses. That was typical of 19th century literature about children. Children were portrayed as perfect little beings who obeyed everything their parents said. Of course, real parents know that's not how it is, but a childish understanding in Ellen White's youthful mind, that must be how children really are and should be, and I'm not that way. And so she felt even more guilty with her very sensitive conscience. She could not live up to these perfect little children. Fortunately, a breakthrough in her spiritual experience occurred at the Buxton, Maine Methodist camp meeting late in the summer of 1841. And this is during the period when William Miller was coming up to Maine and preaching. Upon hearing a convicting sermon on righteousness by faith, Ellen cried out to God for salvation. This is so fascinating because as you read the conversion stories of great preachers and great spiritual leaders in history, many of them attribute their conversion experience to hearing a sermon on the gospel. Ellen White heard a sermon on salvation, on the gospel, and was converted. As I knelt and prayed, reflecting on that experience, she wrote, "Suddenly my burden left me and my heart was light. I can never forget this precious assurance," and that's my bold there, "precious assurance of the pity and tenderness of Jesus toward one so unworthy of his notice." That was the second phase of Ellen White's conversion. There she embraced the beauty of justification by faith, that she's accepted before Christ, not in her own merits, but because of his merits, because of his completed works. We'll talk about those completed works, those redemptive works of Christ more tonight. And so she received assurance, and that would remain in her spiritual experience the rest of her life. Ellen White experienced assurance of salvation, believed in assurance of salvation, and taught assurance of salvation the rest of her life. In my book, Ellen White Under Fire, I have about 5 pages where I start with this quote, and I walk through Ellen White's entire life chronologically, statement after statement, where she describes assurance of salvation in Christ. That was very important to her. And so this was life transforming. In culmination of Ellen's conversion experience was a counseling session in 1843, initiated by her mother with an Adventist Methodist minister named Levi Stockman. Now, Stockman was a Millerite, a popular Millerite preacher. It was an honor for Ellen to meet him. This meeting with Stockman made a profound impact on young Ellen. Now, Stockman, he was dying of tuberculosis. He was marked for the grave. Ellen was coughing. She had tuberculosis. And they literally coughed their way through this interview. Ellen shared with Stockman her experience. She already had several dreams. They weren't really prophetic dreams, but they were very vivid dreams of seeing the face of Jesus smiling upon her and feeling the love of Jesus. And he shared that with Stockman. And he told her, he said, Ellen, I believe that based on your experience, God has something special in store for you. He has a special plan for your life. And that was very encouraging to her to hear that. And of course, she was eventually healed from her tuberculosis or consumption. Stockman eventually died of it. But this meeting with Stockman, followed by a significant prayer meeting experience later that same day, transformed young Ellen's entire experience. Here's where she embraced the beauty of sanctification and victory over sin. This was the third and final phase of Ellen White's conversion experience. Now, this prayer meeting experience that evening was not what we expect. These were the old Methodist camp meeting. They were called Shouting Methodist. And it would be, we would look at that today and say, wow, that's like a wild, charismatic meeting. But that's what they were in those days. Of course, Ellen would move away from that very extreme type of experience, but that was a part of this prayer meeting, and that confirmed her total walk with God, her experience with God, her assurance of salvation, and the power of victory over sin in her life. And so her conversion experience was complete, and this would carry her through one of the most difficult experiences of her life and thousands of others who were Millerites. It carried her through the great disappointment. She writes about the Millerite experience, how they would gather together in groves and they would pray as they were waiting for Jesus to come. And the presence of God, she said, seemed so real. God was with us during that time. That experience strengthened her to make it through the great day of disappointment when Jesus did not come. Interestingly, years later when she would write about the great disappointment, she called it repeatedly the passing of the time. The passing of the time. It was a time period that they, looking back on it, needed to pass through to understand what Jesus was really doing in the sanctuary in heaven. So here's a few pictures of Ellen, some of the earliest pictures we have of her. This is Ellen in her early 30s, the late 1850s, and she married James Springer White on August 30, 1846. He was 25 years old. She was 18. When she was traveling with her sisters, sharing her visionary experience, James heard of this. He was a Millerite preacher. He had baptized like 1,000 Millerites, and so he was a great Millerite preacher. And he was very interested in Ellen's experience. He traveled not with the group. It would have been scandalous for him as a single man to travel with these women, so he traveled separately, but they would meet at the same place. And as he listened to Ellen White share her experiences, he was very interested, and their eyes caught each other, and they began to connect and talk, and they got into what we would describe today as a dating relationship. And they felt maybe they should get married, but they decided, you know what, Jesus is coming so soon. Even after the disappointment, they believed he was still coming very soon. And they thought, we should wait and just serve the Lord totally now. But as time went on, they realized that being married, they could serve the Lord better. And so they got married here with a justice of the peace on August 30, 1846. And their marriage was an interesting marriage. I had the privilege of being an external examiner for a doctoral dissertation where I was on the committee and able to read the dissertation and critique it. It was about the marriage of James and Ellen White, and it's a very good study. And I had studied this, of course, for years prior to that, but that dissertation I found some interesting insights from this scholar that I hadn't seen before, and it's all about the marriage. And James and Ellen White's marriage, while there was love and romance, their major focus in their marriage was on the development of the church. And that was a major factor. And it was that way with the children as well. Everything was centered around their work for the church. And that meant there were some challenges over the years. Now, James and Ellen, they would have 4 children. I'll talk about the children here in a moment. But their marriage was overall a solid marriage. There was love, but it was mainly focused on ministry. But there came a time years later, it would have been in the 1870s, that James and Ellen ran into some trouble. James was a workaholic, and he had almost worked himself to death, and he had several strokes, minor strokes, because of that. And in the later years, it changed his personality. And instead of the vigorous, positive preacher that he was, he became more cantankerous and irritable. And so he and Ellen began to have some real struggles. And at one point, she was on the West Coast and he was on the East Coast. And he was telling her, I want you to come back so we can go on a camp meeting tour. Well, Ellen wrote a series of letters to her best friend at the time, named Lucinda. And she confided in Lucinda of the struggle she was having with James. She did not want to go back east to be with James. I want to share with you some of the things here that she said. These letters, by the way, all the private letters of Ellen White are published at the Ellen G. White estate. So you can read these there. They're actually working on a series of volumes that will provide comments and explanations, annotations on all of these letters, because in her published books it's easier to understand, but when you're reading a letter, it's talking about this place and that person. Who is that person? What was the situation of the letter? Well, these volumes will explain that. One is out, another one is coming out sometime later this year, I think. It's a 10-year project that will go on, but that's where you really get to know the personal Ellen White, is in what heretofore have been the unpublished letters. But these letters have been released for a while. So here she writes to Lucinda, to her friend about James. And it's insightful to some of the challenges that were happening in their marriage. I've not lost my love for my husband, she wrote to Lucinda Hall, but I cannot explain things. Then a week later she wrote, I cannot but dread the liability of James' changeable moods, his strong feelings, his censures, his viewing me in the light he does. That gives us some background. There were some arguments going on. There was some criticism, some censures. James was criticizing Ellen. But Ellen was a strong-willed person too. And so she wasn't going to be pushed around. So James is in the East. She was in California. He was telling her, come back, let's go and camp meeting together. And she wrote to Lucinda, should I come? James' happiness might suddenly change to complaining and fretting. I am thoroughly disgusted with the state of things, and do not mean to place myself where there is the least liability of its occurring. I must work as God should direct. God in his providence has given us each our work, and we should do it separately, independently. He is happy, I am happy, but the happiness might all be changed should we meet. A great share of my life's usefulness has been lost. You can hear the cry of her heart over the grief of this. I cannot have confidence in James' judgment in reference to my duty. He seems to want to dictate to me as though I were a child. So you can, and those of us that have been married, well, we can relate to that, right? They were real people. They had real challenges like the rest of us here. 2 days later, again, she wrote to Lucinda, I dare not go east without an assurance that God would have me go. I am perfectly willing to go if the light shines that way, but the Lord knows what is best for me, for James, and for the cause of God. My husband is now happy. Blessed news. If my presence is detrimental to his happiness, God forbid I should be connected with him. I will do my work as God leads me. He may do his work as God leads him. We will not get in each other's way. I do not think my husband really desires my society. He charges a good share of his unhappiness upon me. So basically, they had an intentional temporary separation. She'd stay there, he would stay there, because when they were together, the tension was great. Again, she wrote to Lucinda, I think he would be satisfied if he had the entire control of me, soul and body, but this he cannot have. I sometimes think that he is really a sane man, or I sometimes think that he is not really a sane man, but I don't know. May God teach and lead and guide. His last letter has fully decided me to remain this side of the mountain. Well, James wrote to his son Willie about these things, and he wrote, and he also wrote back to Ellen, and here's part of what he wrote to her at one point in this series of letters. I shall use the good old head God gave me until he reveals that I am wrong. Your head won't fit my shoulders. Keep it where it belongs. And I will try to honor God in my own. I shall be glad to hear from you, but don't waste your precious time and strength lecturing me on matters of mere opinions. Now, James respected, even at this point, his wife's prophetic gift. But he's talking about personal things with regard to their relationship here. So, there's a whole series of these letters. And it's most interesting. These letters in the mid-1870s are interesting because years later they were given to the White Estate in the mid-1970s. As a background to that, let me tell you that after writing this series of letters to Lucinda complaining about her husband, Ellen repented, and she wrote to Lucinda and told Lucinda how sorry she was to share these things. That she realizes that Jesus is her burden bearer. She should be sharing these things with Jesus. And so she said to Lucinda, please forgive me. Lucinda, please destroy these letters. Burn them. Well, Lucinda kept the letters in her family, and they were passed down. And they were hidden basically in the family and there were literally thousands of these letters. There were letters of and that family had a wide connection, and there were other letters of other leaders back and forth to one another. Just a treasure trove of Adventist history there, living history in letters. That's one thing about historians of the 19th century. It's valuable because those people were writers, and they recorded everything in diaries and letters. The Civil War letters and diaries are so insightful. So Lucinda's family kept these letters, and eventually in the mid-1970s, a century later, they brought them to the White Estate. And the White Estate looked these letters over and confirmed that these are authentic letters, and they saw this series of letters between Ellen and Lucinda. And they felt that these are very instructive for married people to see that even James and Ellen had struggles, because here's the end of the story. After writing that letter of apology to Lucinda, Ellen also wrote a deep letter of apology to James, telling him how sorry she was. She repented of her attitude towards him. And within a week, guess where she was? Went across the country, went back to James. They went on the camp meeting tour together, and they rekindled their love, and they stayed married until he died in 1881. Too many people give up easy on their marriages today. James and Ellen stuck it out, and they remained in love. So overall, while they had these times of struggle like all marriages do, in the end, they stayed in love. They stuck to their marriage. And Ellen grieved deeply in the loss of James when he died. So, back to the letters. You might be wondering, Ellen asked Lucinda to destroy these letters. But you're reading those, you're sharing some of those letters to us today. But if you go to the will of Ellen White, she intended for the White Estate to be good stewards. See, her will gave all of her letters, her literary corpus, to the White Estate, and they were to manage it. They were to be stewards of it, which means that they were to choose what should be published, what, when and where, and so forth. And the White Estate felt that this series of letters to Lucinda was very instructive, that prophets aren't perfect, to see the human side as well as to see how valuable this can be to marriages that are struggling today. And so I have no hesitation. I've had some people come up and say, hey, Ellen White said destroy these. Why are you reading it? Well, because the White estate felt, as stewards of her writings, that these letters can be very helpful. So in that backdrop, I share them with you now. So that's just a brief story of the marriage of James and Ellen White. They were real people who had real struggles. Now to the children. The youngest son, born in 1860, John Herbert. 1860, this is on the eve of the Civil War. And when John was born, or John Herbert, he didn't have a name yet. And Ellen and James traveled to Battle Creek for a big meeting, which they were really organizing the church. And that's the meeting in 1860 on the eve of the Civil War, when that was happening in the nation. That's when they chose the name Seventh-day Adventist. But they were so focused on choosing a name for the group that they failed to name their fourth child. And after the meeting, James traveled, and Ellen, they still hadn't named the child yet. And Ellen White wrote to friends, our little nameless one is doing well today. And she wrote to another friend, would you please send us a name for nameless one? And so finally they named the baby John Herbert. But little John Herbert became very ill with a terrible disease, erysipelas, which involved inflammation of the skin. The poor little one died suffering in Ellen's arms. She, of course, suffered emotionally at the death of her children, or of this little child. And James came back once he learned of the illness, and the baby was dead by the time he got there. And James himself conducted the funeral for his fourth son. So a lot of challenges our pioneers went through. The oldest son was Henry. Henry lived to be 16 years of age, very gifted young man. He could sing. He had a good personality, very gifted. If he would have lived, he would have made such a profound contribution. He and his mother were a lot alike. He lived to the age of 16. This is right in the midst of the Civil War. He had been outside, got chilled one day. He came down with pneumonia. Now, pneumonia, in those days, there was no antibiotics at all, and so you were like marked for the grave, and he eventually died. On his deathbed, he told his parents how he wanted to witness to his friends, and they went by his bedside and he shared Christ with them. Let's back up a little bit before he died. He and his brother Edson, who I'll say more about in a little bit, they were fascinated with the Civil War, or with the war. Battle Creek was a training ground for soldiers. And just a short distance from where the Whites lived, you had the Northern troops training and marching. And the boys would go and watch them march, and they thought it was really great. And they constructed a little bow and arrow, and they would shoot birds out of the trees, pretending to be soldiers, Northern soldiers in the war. And Henry, being the musical person that he was, he could sing, he could whistle. One day he was watching the soldiers marching, and they had the fifes. Little boys would join the army as drummers or flute players, fifes, to help the cadence of the marching of the soldiers. And often these little boys would go to battle. They would go into war, and they would play the drums or play the flute for the soldiers as they marched in columns into battle. And they would get shot up, of course, and often the little boys died as well. And Henry was fascinated with this. And he was watching them marching to the sound of the fifes, and the fifes got out of breath, and the soldiers had nothing to march from, and Henry started to whistle. And they started marching to his whistling. And the commander told the soldiers to halt, and he started over and asked Henry to whistle. And for the afternoon, they marched at the sound of Henry's whistling. Well, he came home. He was so excited about that. First thing he told his parents was, I want to join the army. And can you imagine that? James and Ellen White, they were pacifists. They were no. They were at the time dealing with the draft issue and all kinds of things like that. My book, A Nation in God's Hands, describes the whole issue of the draft and what they were doing with that. And they're like, oh, no, son. And his parents gently but persuasively talked him down from that. And James, after that, he said that was it. He moved his family up further north, away from where the soldiers were training, so that it wouldn't be a temptation or an influence on the boys. And of course, the neighbors wondered about these. They had Adventist neighbors, and why are your sons pretending like they're playing battle here? We're against that. So it was a challenge for James and Ellen with their boys. But Henry died, and after his death, Ellen White would write, and she said, our home is so lonely, it's so silent. Our sweet singer is no longer here. She called Henry the sweet singer. He was a gifted singer. Here are the two surviving children, little Willie on your screen left, and then Edson over on the... This is nice. I can use my laser, and many screens that I have, they're like those. See, the laser won't work on those screens, but I can use it here. So yes, there is Willie, and there is Edson. Let me tell you about the two boys. We'll start with Edson. Edson White. Here's the young Edson, and then you see the older Edson. They lived to be adults, and both of them made a significant contribution to the church in various ways. But Edson as a youth, see the picture as the young Edson. Oh, Edson. Edson got into trouble. Edson was the trouble child. Ellen White even wrote when he was a boy, see the roughery in him, she told one of her friends. He was just different. Now, little Willie, who I'll say more about in a moment, Willie and Ellen were two peas in a pod. They were really connected personality-wise. So it was with Henry, but Edson was a different case altogether. Edson did everything exactly opposite to what his mother said and wrote. She talked about reading the fiction of the day, the cheap dime novels, which are sensational stories. That's the type of fiction that she condemned. She said, don't read that. Edson read those books. He'd bring those books to church sometimes. And she talked about frugality and economy with your funds. Well, Edson, he saved up money, and he bought an expensive jacket and a watch with a link chain on it, and he took that. It was like a week's salary, and he paraded up and down the streets in front of the Review and Herald with his fancy clothes. He would sit in church, and his mother described it. She said he would sit in church, prop his feet up on the pew, lay his head back, and sleep through the sermon. And this is often sitting right next to his mother. But even more, Edson tended to get his brothers in trouble, particularly his little brother, Willie. Share with you some of Ellen's thoughts and challenges about Edson. And she wrote him many letters over the years. She wrote epistles to him as he grew up. Now, here's one letter she's writing, and you can sense the discouragement in her voice. She's writing to her teenage son, "Oh, Edson, it is the knowledge of these things." Or let me start from the back here, from the beginning. This is in 1865. She wrote about his disposition to disobedience. "You not only disobeyed us yourself, but led Willie, who was 5 years younger, into disobedience also. Oh, Edson, it is the knowledge of these things that is wearing me out and bringing upon me discouragement, which will compel me to cease laboring in the cause of God. You had so little sense of the true value of character. You seemed as much pleased in the society of Marcus Ashley," that was his bad boy friend, "Marcus Ashley, as with your own innocent brother Willie." And she wrote to Edson about Willie. Now get the context here. She's writing to Edson, and here's what she says about Willie. "He is a treasure, beloved of God. But I fear your influence will ruin him. My poor Willie. I see no way for us but to cease traveling and do what we can to save our own children." Well, that comparison of himself with good little Willie was a claw in his side. And as he grew to be older, he began to really resent his brother Willie. Now, Ellen, she was not a perfect parent. It was a mistake to say those type of things to Edson when she was probably upset at him. Right? Not everything she wrote was under inspiration, okay? That's an important point to realize. These letters were raw. They were real. Inspiration was not operating then. You read her unpublished writings, you can tell when it's operating because she'll say, "The Lord has shown me." But a lot of these things, she's just writing as a desperate mother, doing the best that she can. And Edson was such a stress for her. At any rate, as he grew, he continued to disobey. He married a girl that both his parents disapproved of. Ellen White, some of the letters she wrote to Edson about his father, she said, your father weeps over your case. So he grew into adulthood, and he decided he was done with Adventism. He was done with Christianity. And the first thing he did, he communicated that first to his brother Willie. Maybe as a jab. I'm done with all this. Well, of course, Willie communicated that to his mother. She went into orbit, obviously. No, please, Edson, don't do that. She actually had a dream about Edson on a sinking ship. And so with a way that only a mother can do, she wrote a lengthy letter, another one of her many, many epistles to Edson. And she appealed to him to come to the Lord. It's really a meaningful, beautiful letter, but for interest's sake, I'm just going to read to you just at the beginning. Now, this is in June 21, 1893. Edson was 43 years, okay? So he was ready to give up on everything. This letter was handwritten. Most of Ellen White's letters are typed. She would give her handwritten, you have all the original documents at the White Estate, she would give a handwritten letter to the typist who would type it up and make a typed copy of it. But some letters that were very personal, very sensitive, she did not allow a typist to see those. So this was handwritten. And at the top, you have scribbled at the very top of the letter, Edson, please read this carefully. Do not cast it aside or burn it. He evidently had burned some previous letters, okay? So she's appealing to him to not do that. She says, I do not want to put this in the hands of a typist. And so she apologized for her scribbling. This is a moving letter appealing to Edson's heart to not forsake the Lord, that God still has something for him to do in life, because he'd not really done much with his life up to this point. His character was kind of vacillating. At any rate, he finally gave his heart to the Lord, perhaps for the first time. He was moved at this letter. He responded favorably to it and committed himself to the Lord. And then afterward, he wondered, what could he do? Now, this was in the latter 19th century, okay? This was in the 1890s, early 1890s, and the work in the South was opening up. It had been really challenging, and there really had not been any organized work in the South. And so Edson took it upon himself to go engage in the work for the blacks in the South. He wanted to bring them to the Lord. And he worked closely with his mother. He went down in the South and raised money and came up with a brilliant, creative idea. He built a steamboat. And so he steamed up and down the Mississippi and would minister to the black people on the shoreline. That way they could reach them easier than in the city. In the 1890s, while I said the black work was opening up, in a sense it was opening up, in another sense it was closing, because it was a very difficult time. While the Civil War was over, slavery was gone, but you had another surge of racism in the South. And really it was slavery in a new form, because the white supremacy, they were seeking to squelch any rights the blacks had after the Civil War, and it became a very dangerous area to work. Anyway, Edson, he went down there and he worked for the Lord, and that's a whole story in of itself. I'm tempted to launch off and tell you his adventures in the South and some of the things that Ellen White told him then. But that's an important part of his experience, and he did that for the rest of his, of at least, which should say for the next decade. He eventually would come back to the North, but he made a profound contribution. In many ways, he could be called the pioneer of the work in the South among the blacks. And there's a huge population of black Seventh-day Adventists in the South, and that can be attributed all the way back to Edson's work down there. So his mother's influence was significant upon him. Willie was a different case. Willie took over his father's role. When James died, he was the one who helped Ellen White with her writings. And she was given a vision showing that Willie, or William, would take his place. And as an adult, you see the adult picture of Willie up there. He managed Ellen White's writings. He managed her large staff and edited her writings. And after she died, he began the work of the Ellen G. White estate. So he played a major role. But as a boy, he was a typical boy. He was different from Edson. He was much more obedient. But he was a normal boy. And in Battle Creek one year, he really disliked his teacher. And so he wrote a poem about his teacher that he disliked. And one day when school let out, he stayed behind and scribbled this poem on the chalkboard and then left. And when all the children and the teacher filed into the room that next morning, this is what they read on the chalkboard. The devil flew east, west, north, and south, and picked Miss Jones up in his mouth. But when he saw he had a fool, he dropped her here to teach this school. So he was a very normal little boy. And it was found out that he wrote the poem, and he got in trouble and was punished for it. But that was a rare case. Now, as he grew older, he was nicknamed Sleeping Willie. He was one of these people that could go to sleep anywhere, any place, at any time. Doesn't matter the noise, the circumstances. And one day, he was on the platform with his mother. He's an adult. And she's speaking, and she's sharing a vision with this audience. It's a solemn time, and she's speaking into her message, and she noticed some smiles on people's faces. And she stops, and she could hear this familiar sound. She turned back around, and head, beard was on chest. Willie was gone. He was out. Very typical. And she turned back around, and all the smiles disappeared. They thought, oh, he's in trouble. What's she going to do? Well, she proceeded to tell them a story. She said, I remember when Willie was a baby, and I would preach in Battle Creek at the big church, the Battle Creek Tabernacle. And the pulpit was large, and because my baby Willie couldn't be separated from me, the brethren constructed a little cradle. And so when I would go up to preach, I would put little Willie in that cradle, put it in that pulpit, and with my foot, I could rock him while I preached, and he would sleep through the sermon. Well, as you can see, brothers and sisters, today, he's not gotten over that habit. And of course, all the laughter woke Willie up, and that just shows something I'm going to get into in a moment here, is that Ellen White enjoyed humor. She laughed a lot. We tend to think of her as gloom and prophet and the burden of the prophetic ministry. But Ellen White had a lot of joy in life. Yes, she was solemn, but because she had a lot of burdens, but she had lots of joy as well. In fact, years ago I wrote an article, it was published in the Review and Herald, and it was about Ellen. It was a series about Ellen White. And I didn't do the whole series. I just did one of the articles in the series, but it was on Ellen White and joy. I was able to chronicle the joy in Ellen White's life. You can look that up online if you want in the Review and Herald archives. But she had lots of joy and enjoyed lots of humor, and I'm going to share with you some things that brought lots of laughter in her own life here in a little bit. But that's a story about Willie. Oh, I should add, this is a story I usually like to tell during this time, is, and I'm watching my time is limited here. I get carried away in some of these stories. But real quick, I was a youth pastor. I've been pastoring for 10 years in Gulf States Conference. Then I moved to Illinois Conference, and I was a youth pastor before I went to teach at Southern. And I would use humor in the stories with the kids and so forth. And one of the members brought a stack of Ellen White quotes and put it on my porch one morning. To this day, I don't know who that was, but they had a stack of Ellen White quotes where she talks about the danger of humor in the pulpit. And she does make some statements about preachers, Adventist preachers, using too much humor, but they didn't understand the context. The Adventist preachers were following Methodist preachers. The habit was to get up at the sermon and tell jokes unrelated to the sermon and get people to laughing and then start preaching the sermon. Adventist preachers started doing that. In that context, she says, don't do that. Don't use humor in the pulpit. But she was not against humor at all, because she just told a funny story about Willie, as I shared. So there's a context for that. So once I understood that context, I didn't feel guilty about those statements and continued to use humor with the young people. And I try to do that whenever I can with my students today in classes as well. Here she is in her late 30s. Here's Ellen White in 1875 at 48 years old. Here's a familiar picture of her in 1878 when she was working on the Spirit of Prophecy series I mentioned last night. And here she is with her twin sister Lizzie. Again, the same picture I showed before, but this leads me to share with you a letter that she wrote when Lizzie was on her deathbed. She was appealing to Lizzie to come to Jesus. Lizzie had never come to Christ. What's interesting is she did not say, Lizzie, you need to become a baptized Seventh-day Adventist. Lizzie, you need to start paying your tithe. Lizzie, you need to become a vegan. She didn't say anything like that. She said, Lizzie, all you need to do is accept Jesus as your Savior. He will take you just as you are. Lizzie, please, I'm paraphrasing now because it's a whole beautiful movie letter. Lizzie, please come to Jesus. Jesus will accept you and take all your burdens, and he'll forgive you and take you into heaven. Lizzie, please come to Jesus. That shows us the evangelistic spirit of Ellen White. She was a great evangelist. She led many people to Christ. That assurance I spoke of a little while ago, she would share that with others and bring them into an experience of assurance of salvation. But unfortunately, she would say in later years about her sister that she did not expect to see Lizzie in the kingdom because Lizzie never accepted Ellen's invitation to become a follower of Christ, to accept the salvation that Jesus offers. So here is Ellen White in 1881 when James died. As I mentioned, that was a time of great grief for her. Here she is in spring of 1888. You know what 1888 was? What happened in Adventist history that year? That was the year of the 1888 Minneapolis meetings that fall, where the subject of righteousness by faith was crucial. This denomination had been spiraling down into legalism, and second-generation Adventists had lost sight of the gospel and of Christ, and they were focusing on the law. And Ellen White herself always understood the gospel, and she was concerned about this. And so these meetings in Minneapolis, Minnesota, to make a long story short, were very impactful. They put the church back on the right Christian track and kept it from spiraling down into legalism and brought Christ back to the center. Two figures, Jones and Wagner. Ellen White affirmed what they were teaching. That's a great story there. But here she is in this picture. There she is right there holding her Bible. After the 1888 meeting, she had some conflict with the General Conference brother, and they wanted to get her away from them. And so they sent her to Australia in the mission work. She didn't really want to go, but she felt the Lord can lead through the General Conference brother in spite of their conflict. And so she went, and her first year was a bad year. She was deathly sick and wondered why the Lord brought her to Australia. But in the end, the decade she spent in Australia was one of the most productive writing decades of her life. There she hammered out our educational philosophy that's still used today in Adventist schools. A host of her educational books were written then. Also, she wrote her main books on the life of Christ. The beginning of that decade, she published Steps to Christ, then Desire of Ages, Christ Object Lessons, Thoughts from a Mount of Blessings. These great books on salvation and on Jesus were written during that period. And there she sits, Korenbong, in Australia. And this was her pet dog in Australia. She named him after the evil Assyrian king, Tiglath-Pileser. Imagine calling your dog, hey, Tiglath-Pileser, here boy. He was the watchdog. And that shows you a bit of the humor in Ellen White. And some wonder why the doghouse is crooked. That's because in the spring rains it would flood, and the doghouse drained easier that way. So this is the point I like to share a bit of the humor of Ellen White. She, of all places, interestingly, in Testimonies, Volume 1, she used humorous language in describing some things. She's talking about some Adventists who took Reformed dress to an extreme, where they dressed in a very tasteless manner. And she wrote that sisters, when about their work, should not put on clothing which would make them look like images to frighten the crows from the corn. And then she was telling her granddaughters how to be tasteful with their dress. You don't want to dress every day as if you're going to a funeral, or when the clothing of some tasteless individuals, quote, looks as if it flew and lit upon their persons. So a little bit of humor in that. She enjoyed this humor in her life. At Elms Haven, her grandchildren who grow up and tell the stories of her, they said that they often heard her laughing. It doesn't matter where you were in the Elms Haven home, if something struck her as humorous, and it happened often, they say, you could hear her belly laugh. They said sometimes when they were playing in the front yard or in the backyard, they could hear Grandma White's belly laugh. She had a favorite dessert. Believe it or not, Ellen White ate desserts. She spoke about eating too much sugar, against that, but a balanced, she was balanced in things. Her favorite dessert was lemon pie. She loved lemon pie. Amen? All right, we have another lemon pie. Sorry, I'm a real sinner. It's chocolate pie. It's chocolate peanut butter pie for me. Okay? You like chocolate peanut butter pie? Well, according to Ellen White, we're not sinning, brother. We can eat some pie. Okay? Again, a balance, temperance in all things. Not 2 pieces of pie, but a piece of pie, that type thing. And my favorite story is when she was coming back from the coming back from Australia rather, they heard of a group of believers on the island of Samoa. And so they stopped by, and Ellen wanted to visit with them and encourage them. And she had her daughter-in-law, May, with a little baby, infant child. And so they went up to the shoreline in the small boat, and these hefty native men came out there excited to see her. And 2 of them, they put their arms in the shape of a chair and asked Sister White to sit on it. So she sat on it. They carried her up on the beach and put her on a rock, and so she's facing the ocean, watching as they're about to go get May. So one comes up to May and with an umbrella takes the baby in his arms from May. The other one turns his sweaty back towards May and motions for her to crawl on. And the boat's out on the water now, okay, and the waves are splashing against the back, and so May's skeptical about this. Ellen's on the rock watching all of this, and so May scrambles on his back, and it's tropical area. He's hot and sweaty, and so she begins to slip, and she's holding on, and the waves are splashing behind, and so he's walking, carrying her on the beach, and she's slipping and trying to hang on for dear life, and Ellen is watching this, and so May would write about this later, and she says now, and Mother White, something struck her funny about that, and she began to laugh and laugh and laugh. She laughed so hard she fell off the rock. And when the men went up to pick her up, they were afraid she was hurt. She was still laughing. I love to share that story with my students because I want them to see that humorous side of Ellen White. She loved life and she loved laughing and humor and saw nothing wrong with that at all. So that's a part of the personal side of Ellen White and humor, and there's plenty more. She loved to give snacks to children in their play. Snacks between meals, can you believe that? She did that for children. See, there's a balance to some of her strong statements about health and so forth, counsels and diets and foods. That book is not that helpful. Counsels, because it doesn't give the context. If you read it with an understanding that those statements need to be understood in context, yes, it can be helpful. But if you just read it like is the Bible, on health, that's where we've had extremes in health. In fact, you know what Ellen White herself called extreme? These people that are extreme, get extreme in their health. She said that's not health reform, that's health deform. And that can happen. People take vegetarianism too far and things like that and become the judge of what everybody else should eat. That type of attitude. She was adamantly against that. Here she is toward the end of her life at Elms Haven in 1907 with her grandchildren, happy grandmother, surrounded with her children, grandchildren. Here she is speaking at Loma Linda. This is that picture I said a moment ago, where this is at the dedication of Loma Linda. She's speaking to an audience. And in the 19th century, there were no microphones, and Ellen White could project her voice. This is a smaller group, but they describe her speaking at crowds of up to 20,000. In those days, camp meetings were evangelistic. It wasn't just for the saints. It was for everybody. So people would come in from the town just to hear Ellen White speak for They heard of her reputation. 20,000 people. And she projected her voice where they all could hear her. And she was so interesting and engaging that they would sit on the edge of their seats listening through the whole time. Here she is with her helper in later life, Sarah McInturfer. Ellen, in the 1870s, on a wagon train, she had been bucked off a horse and broke her ankle. And so she wasn't able to walk a lot in later life. Due to her small size, she became heavy-set, but she loved to get out and experience as much fresh air as she could. One day she was in Washington, D.C., and the President of the United States came by with his entourage and nodded at Ellen and Sarah. And she wrote about that in her diary, how exciting it was to see the President. And she wrote her children, he bowed to us. He bowed to us. The lady had seen angels, and she was still excited to see the President of the United States. Here she is at the 1909 General Conference, the last General Conference she would experience. She died 6 years after that, and she's sitting next to Stephen Haskell, who proposed to her after James died. She tactfully declined, felt the Lord wanted her to be single the rest of her life and focus on full-time ministry, which she did. It's at this General Conference, she was one of the speakers, and she was the last speaker on a Sunday afternoon to end it. This would be her last time before a General Conference. This is my favorite story to tell, and she was before that vast throng. She preached a moving sermon, and when she finished, she put her Bible in the pulpit. She turned to take her seat. All eyes were watching. There was a sense that this would be the last time they would ever hear her at a General Conference. She'd been there from the beginning of the movement. Here she was in age years. But she paused, every eye riveted upon her. She turns back around, walks up to the pulpit, takes that Bible, and with arms trembling with age, holds that Bible before that vast throng. She said, "Brethren, I commend to you this book." And that's all she said. Put the Bible back on the desk and went and took her seat. Those were her last official words to the General Conference at large. She could have held up Desire of Ages, a great controversy, but no, she held up the Bible. And that was more than just a kindly gesture to the Scriptures. It was symbolic of her lifelong passion to exalt the Bible before her people. That was her main focus, was Scripture. And that's a great story. So she went back to Elmshaven, where she had spent the last 15 years of her life. You probably know the story where she was going upstairs, and as many elderly people do, if they're not careful, she slipped, fell, broke her hip. She was bedridden the last 6 months of her life. In July of 1915, Ellen White passed. Very peaceful family surrounding her bed. That long, productive life was at last at rest. You can imagine the funeral. There were 2 funerals on the West Coast and a final funeral at Battle Creek. Here is the picture of the Battle Creek funeral. This is July 24, 1915. You can imagine, here's the graveside service, all of the people there, the thousands of people, and the question on everyone's mind was, what are we going to do now? Who's going to teach us and guide us? They had had the living gift of prophecy among them. But it was now time to turn to her writings. And that's what they eventually did. There were a few contenders that wanted to pick up the prophetic mantle after that, but as time went on, it was clear that they were not genuine. It wasn't necessary, because everything we need is in those writings. I should clarify that. Everything we need is in the Bible. Everything we need is in the Bible, okay? It's the Bible first, but the point about those writings is that they point to the Bible. But they give us counsel and instruction for these last days. So it was a turning point, a major turning point in Adventist history, the death of Ellen White. Here's the family burial plot. There's a wall there now, and here's the flowers put in the shape of a Bible, and it's from Revelation 22:12. Behold, my reward is with me. Very appropriate for Ellen. I think the best way to conclude this is the testimony of A.G. Daniels, our most productive General Conference president, the most well-known and effective General Conference president who worked with Ellen White for several decades. And After she died, 20 years later, on his deathbed, he was finishing his book, The Abiding Gift of Prophecy. He was writing about the gift of prophetic ministry in Ellen White. He had worked with her so long, and he concludes with these words. In this present year of our Lord, 1935, Mrs. White has been at rest 20 years, while I have been toiling on. I had 23 years of direct observation of her life work. Since her death, I have now had 20 additional years for thoughtful reflection and study of that life and its fruits. Now at an advanced age, with the constraint of expressing only sober, honest truth, I can say that it is my deep conviction that Mrs. White's life far transcends the life of anyone I have ever known or with whom I have ever associated. She was uniformly pleasant, cheerful, and courageous. She was never careless, flippant, or in any way cheap in conversation or manner of life. She was a personification of serious earnestness regarding the things of the kingdom. I never once heard her boast of the gracious gift God had bestowed upon her or of the marvelous results of her endeavors. She did rejoice in the fruitage, but gave all the glory to Him who wrought through her. I realize that these are grave statements, but they have come from the deepest conviction and soundest judgment that I am capable of rendering. They are uttered in the sobering atmosphere of my last illness as I face the judge of all the earth, before whose presence I realize that I soon shall stand. And he died shortly after this book was published. Anybody ever remember Paul Harvey? Famous news commentator? He was familiar with Ellen White. I'm going to end with this. In one of his broadcasts on September 25, 1997, his noon broadcast, he said this: women have been honored on American postage stamps for more than 100 years, starting with one woman who was not an American, Queen Isabella, in 1893. Since then, 86 women have been honored, ranging from Martha Washington to Marilyn Monroe. And many other women authors like Louise May Alcott, Emily Dickinson, Woody Cather, and Rochelle Carson. But I can name an American woman author who has never been honored thus, though her writings have been translated into 148 languages. More than Marx or Tolstoy, more than Agatha Christie, more than William Shakespeare. Only now is the world coming to appreciate her recommended prescription for optimum spiritual and physical health. Ellen White. You don't know her? Get to know her. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for the real Ellen White. Well, she had a great gift of prophetic ministry, yet she was like us, a real human. It just reminds us of your abundant grace, how you work with all of us, and you have a work for all of us to do. So bless us as we think about these writings. Help us to appreciate them more, to read them more, to understand them correctly. Continue to bless this camp meeting as we go through the afternoon and evening. We put it in your hands and pray for your Spirit in Jesus' name. Amen. And tomorrow at this time, I will talk about how to interpret Ellen White, how to correctly read Ellen White. That's what's gotten so many Adventists and former Adventists into trouble, is a failure to correctly interpret Ellen White's writings. How do you do that? I'll talk about that tomorrow. Let's see, is that mine? Oh yeah, that's my mechanic, my Nissan card.